hybrid research transmission system operator in Lithuania. And I will talk about that program sometime later. I'm happy to share all the good and challenging things that happen over there. On the other hand, I'm also certified as PMP and PGMP, and as well as a few other certificates related to project and program management. I'm also a partnership associate professor teaching at International Project Management Program of Vilnius University Business School. Needless to say, I'm excited about project management theory and practice. And although I am one of staunch believers in the saying by Albert Einstein that there is nothing more practical than a good theory, there is a lot I get from being a practitioner myself and reading books by other practitioners. And that brought me last year to the book from 2007 by Nicholas Nassim Taleb named The Black Swan. And this presentation is pretty much inspired by this book. I'm trying to follow this book in my logic, and it inspired some of the thoughts that I'm planning to share with you that apply specifically to project management, how it affects the way we do project management and program management. The idea of the Black Swan is actually quite simple. It is about the things we don't know, not just the things that we know that we don't know, like whether it's going to rain tomorrow, but more about the things we don't know we don't know. A good name for it in English is we don't fathom, or as it's called differently, unknown unknowns. What Nicholas Nassim Taleb stated was quite revolutionary back in 2007. Things we don't know can hurt us hard, much harder than those we know. I will start explaining it in a minute, so bear with me. First of all, a quick check. If what you see is a business growth trend of a specific company or industry, would you agree to invest in it? See, stable 4.9% growth. That's what we call a stable growth.
Looks good.
Looks good, absolutely. I would. So my question is then, how about this one? What you're looking at is a number of billions of passenger kilometers in global airline industry. COVID-19 pandemic decimated the entire 17-year-old long trend. And what is important, there were no signs or warnings it could happen all the way till 2019. Besides modest, barely distinguishable slumps in 2001, that's 9/11, and 2008, that's a Great Recession. But other than that, nothing gave any indication that things like that will happen. Suddenly, the entire industry collapses at minus 66%. And think about this. Nothing, absolutely nothing in history led us to believe this would happen easily. Before things happen, we could be led to believe that there is no such thing. I said I don't plan to dwell on theory only, so another example is quite practical. I put this poll up on one of the more popular LinkedIn groups that includes professional project managers, asking them if they were managing any project by the end of year 2019, if there was a mention of a pandemic or an epidemic anywhere in the risk register by the end of 2019. So on 31st of December, 2019, check your risk register if you're managing a project. Did you have a mention of pandemic or epidemic for that matter among your risks? The results now are in, and 630 people, of course, who responded there. Well, they were self-selecting sample, and this is probably not a very scientific study, but let's cut a bit of slack here, given that there is no immediate reason why they would have a bias towards any answer. So we find that 77% of responders did not have neither pandemic or even epidemic mentioned in their risk registers. Although I said this is a professional community. These are not starting newbies. And what leads us to believe is that we are at the brink of something that actually exists. So what is the black swan? The thinker and the derivative trader, Nicholas Nassim Taleb, total practitioner, coined the term in his book, Black Swan, well, right before Great Recession unfolded. When he published the book, there was no Great Recession. He did some predictions about it there, but the book is not good for its predictions. The book is good for ability to look into things that cannot be predicted. The general definition from Investopedia is that the black swan is an unpredictable event that is beyond what is normally expected of a situation and has potentially severe consequences. So we are talking about big things. And in other words, being project managers, we understand the black swan as a unknown risk event of extremely high impact. Nassim Taleb argues that while being on the fringes, black swans have a disproportionate overall impact on economy, society, and of course, projects and programs. This is somewhat recognized by adding the concept to the 7th edition of PMBOK. It's a new one, 2002 and 21. That's 14 years later. It was also mentioned that in 2017 edition of Risk Management Standard by PMI, but generally it hasn't been very much covered in project management. The name Black Swan itself derives a homage to the actual black swan, which was used as a metaphor for something that does not exist for centuries, pretty much like a pink elephant. Well, until the actual black swan was discovered in Australia. It's a living reminder that in professional and personal lives, we should always be ready to be surprised and our held convictions to be shattered. Funnily enough, Nicholas Nassim Taleb did not want to describe COVID-19 as black swan, stating it was entirely predictable. Instead, he said, it's a classic case of a white swan. This also got me thinking, and I'm planning to explain my understanding of swan grayscale colors in quite a few minutes. But let's head on back to what we know best, project management, and specifically risk management part of project management. We will start with important detour. So how do we identify, classify, prioritize, and manage risks? How do we plan response actions in our world today, in real life? In fact, it is all very dependent on the tools we use. The first tool we use is risk register. Let me remind you how project managers, if we dissect and analyze how they're actually doing it, are using this tool. So they start with having a baseline plan, which by default does not account for any risks. So we have a plan that's very optimistic. A disclaimer. There's always someone in the audience always mentioning that risks are not just threats, they are also opportunities, and we need to account for those if we are to be highly professional project managers. To which my response is, yes, I know. It doesn't change a bit in my argumentation. You can run it yourself at home if you like, and if you want to find out for yourself. So let's move on, focusing for the sake of simplicity on risks as threats. So we start with the baseline plan. And then we start something called risk identification exercise. And risk identification exercise focuses on something we call a risk event, something that has to happen, which has not yet happened, to enable the impacts. It has a certain impact to a product, delivery processes, underlying resources and systems in projects. And then we add a record into the database called risk register. We've all seen a number of examples of our risk register, but all of feature pretty much the same information: probability, impact, description of the risk event itself, risk response plan, linked to risk event. So we do that. After applying preventative resources, we turn our baseline plan into master plan. And that's the important thing. So our master plan, which we communicate to our management, is the plan that takes into account the preventative actions. So these things that we have to do as a part of our risk management, they include something that we need to do right away or regularly to reduce probability or impact of the risk event. And once we do that, we have a master plan which says, okay, we taken into account what we are supposed to do as risk management. This is our master plan. But there are also possibilities that our preventative actions did not have all full effect and they did not prevent all the risk events. So something can still happen. And we need to have a contingency plan, so something that will turn up if risk realizes and corrective risk response changes apply. So both risk responses, preventative and corrective risk responses, are changes. We have to use change management. So in one way or another, we then use a contingency plan if something happened and your master plan becomes a contingency plan. Your contingency plan becomes a master plan. And that's basically how risk management works in our understanding. What I call this is a scenario-based risk identification because it focuses on the list of scenarios that can play out. Each new scenario would come with a new risk to describe, assess, and prioritize. Such a method allows for uniform description and presentation of risk, ability to use the probability impact matrix, should you want it, of course, and simplifies communication of those risks. It is so widespread that we don't even spare a minute to think there could be other methods because it works so well. Now, scenario-based risk identification depends on being able to articulate risk events or scenarios, their causes, consequences, impacts, and probability. More than that, scenario-based risk identification has to get those risks from somewhere. So we need to populate the risk register. We have to come up with those risk events. They just don't appear in the risk register. Somebody has to put them in. So now let's zoom in on a big picture. Where do we get those risk descriptions, or as we call it, risk patterns? Try to reconstruct our mental process, how we do it. So we usually brainstorm, sit down with the team, maybe project manager.
Brainstorming, like sessions or something like this.
Yeah, we put look into lessons learned, like this one here. Yeah, so these are structured sources of information where we could get the sources of our risk. Organizational assets is something that lessons learned of the organization, what we have acquired from the rest of the team. So these are structured sources of our risk patterns. Now we have, in our team, we have people who have experience. You could have experience. You could have your knowledge of possible risks in similar projects. So you to pick up that from personal experience. That's less structured. Also general and applied knowledge about how projects should work, how they work, what can happen to them. Maybe you read some books, maybe you saw some webinars, maybe you read stories in the news, what could happen wrong. And this general applied knowledge can be used to put together those risk patterns. Finally, you can have imagination. You can start thinking, being creative, and think up what risks could be. How about a train gets, let's say, rolls down from the track and crosses the street, hits the building catches on fire. The firemen rush to the fire site and they overrun your key programming expert. So that would be an imagination. Also is a source of your possible risk patterns, which is fairly unstructured. And of course, when we come to prioritize, we do several things. Number one, we prefer structured and well-established risk patterns over unstructured and unquantifiable. So it's unlikely that you will pick up your risks from imagination. You will probably, somebody will pick up in the team when you're brainstorming, especially if you're doing it with a few beers, but probably they will look into lessons learned first. Well, what happened before? What do we know? What will lift for it? We will, of course, talk about personal experience, but also if it's unquantifiable and unstructured, it's less appropriate. So organizations prefer in their projects to pick up something that's well known, where we can replicate. So they pick up the same risks from previous risk registers into the new ones. And second thing that happens is we apply something called probability impact filter. Theoretically, we should prioritize risks after we populate a risk register. I have bad news for you guys. It never happens. We prioritize before we fill in risk register. We think about what is important, what is likely, what is going to have significant impact. And the reason is, if we don't, we are realizing that there will be most of the time that you're spending in this project will be populating a risk register. So people apply probability impact filter consciously and unconsciously before those risks even land into the risk register. So finally, and it's important, there is no access to unknown unknowns. Unknown unknowns are things that we don't think about. So there is no source and there is no arrow here that allows unknown unknowns to land into risk register, unless somehow it seeps into your imagination. But generally, you don't have such an access. And this is where brings us to the next thing here, is that if we look into contents of a risk register, we can structure according to a model which I call the land of uncertainty. So this is something we have seen a lot of times. For one thing, it is the basis of so-called probability impact matrix, which I will skim upon somewhat later. The probability axis shows how probable event is, and the impact axis determines the overall impact of the project benefits. This is a natural habit of various pieces of risks that I'm happy to recap quickly. So to make things simpler, I will just discuss the most extreme cartoonish examples, but you have to keep in mind that there are no hard rules here. There are no hard boundaries. There are lots of in-betweens. At the top right corner, this is it. This we keep predators here. So large predators cannot be ignored. We usually plan our project to heavily mitigate. These are well-known risks. There are just few of them. So we always take them into account. They travel from one project to another, and they always looked into, because they have significant probability and significant impact. We can't miss them. They are there. The bottom right corner is inhabited by pets. Small furry animals, with more bark than bite, which we love to write down in our risk register so they have volume and substance. But in case someone checks, of course. But generally, impact is low, and we need to cover for them because there are many of them. In the left bottom corner, we have bugs. So the bugs are essentially small, nasty, but low probability and low impact risks. Something that can happen, something that will probably happen. There are lots of things that can happen, and most likely we will tolerate them. That's the approach. So we will just accept the risks rather than mitigate every single of them, because they don't just appear there. We have a large swarm of them. There are too many of them to think about. So to a certain degree, they create a swarm. We can plan for response, which is essentially to react when they come, because we are not afraid of the impact. It's low. For a want of an example, we could take a risk of a floor janitor quitting a job in the project of building a spaceship to Mars. It's a risk. It's just very unlikely and very low impact. So the only thing is that we need to know is that usually being this small and making this black swarm, we call them we have them in two categories. We have those that we know and those that we don't know. We call them unknown unknowns. And those that are unknown unknowns usually are not articulated. We don't put them into risk register. We don't see how they appear. And the good thing is that they can be managed very well with management reserve. So we have to keep reserves in schedule. We have to keep reserves in the budget. And given that they are pretty independent on each other, they don't usually reinforce each other. We are able to cover those risks with management reserve. And the thing is, unknown unknowns can be sometimes not so convenient. Unknown unknowns can be severe. 9/11 was unknown. Enron collapse was unknown. Ever given crisis in Suez was unknown. We didn't even plan for it. We didn't have a plan how to do things when supply chain is disrupted by a stuck freighter, or the crisis of refugees in Lithuania and Poland border with Belarus was unknown if you look at it from a perspective of, let's say last year. We couldn't plan for it. Now we have to deal with it. And these are not small examples. These are big examples. And that's the land of swans, so as our swan lake. We keep them in various colors. We have white, gray, and black swans. They are somewhat different. So bear with me, I will try to talk about those distinctions. So basically, the taxonomy of swans is not exact science, and though most people agree about what black swans are, boundaries between white and gray swans are somewhat blurry, specifically because the theory comes from investment analysts and they get bored immediately at the first mention of the white swan before the academics work out the details. But for the sake of clarity, let's set some strict boundaries for our discussion so we can go forward with another two-axis matrix. So let us start with the white swan. It falls straight into typology of known unknowns, which means that we can identify and describe the risk event. And by identification, I mean ability to assign certain distinctive features to it that we can use to distinguish this event from other events even before it happens. In other words, if my risk event is an earthquake, we have a mental picture of an event that differs from a mental picture of, say, a flood. So we could put an earthquake in our risk register because we know earthquake exists. We have historical data to support. They are fairly rare, but they still exist, and we have a practice of putting floods or earthquake into the risk registers. So it could be historic or it could be delivered from reasonably accurate calculations. What exactly constitutes accuracy in assessing probability is very well up to us to define. It's not exact science, as I said. We like white swans because we could add them to our risk register and then project them onto the probability impact matrix. But changes of ownership or strategy, market crisis, earthquakes, hurricanes, other climate change related events are falling into this category. We have data, we can predict trends, we can say when something will happen within the reason. It's only expected that the responsible project manager takes this on board when building the risk register. The next creature is more interesting. It's still unknown because we can articulate the risk about event itself. We can think about it without training our brains. The gray swan risk fails us in understanding the probability because it is considered either close to impossible or there is no accurate data or qualified logic to estimate the probability with any level of confidence. Before they actually happened, global pandemic or Hurricane Katrina were gray swans, simply because there is nothing unnatural or surprising about them happening, although we cannot predict with any level of accuracy the probability and sometimes the consequential impact. The jury is still out there on asteroid impact, meeting extraterrestrial life, or that one of the nuclear launch centers will become a ransomware target. I can think about that. As you can see, I can think of the event, so it is identifiable. I cannot predict its odds of happening in the next decade, which makes it unpredictable. Finally, last but not least, we have the black swan that shares unpredictability with the gray swan, but also it is special in the fact that it is unidentified, undescribable, and unfathomable before it actually hits. This is a big topic for Nicholas Nassim Taleb's book. It does not have to be anything that violates the laws of nature, or even something that no one in the whole world ever thought possible. In the end, the world population is huge. There is a large number of engineers, futurologists, fiction writers, dreamers, or simply people with inside knowledge to ever assert that. It is enough to say that the institutions, structures, and people who could take action on the risk event failed even to discuss it as a possibility, much less identify it as a risk. If it is not something you have thought of, it is as good as the black swan for all practical reasons. So examples of real black swans include 9/11, Fukushima disaster, the Great Recession, quite recent incident with Ever Given, our case of refugees at the border with Belarus. So when it comes to swan colors, the key differences are these: white swans, identified, predictable; gray swans, identified, unpredictable; and black swans, unidentified and unpredictable. How important is blackness of the swan? So as I mentioned before, for practical applications, white and gray swans that remain unidentified until the very event, they are just as good as black swans. And that's also probably how we could look into those. For various reasons, extreme known unknowns remain unidentified in the risk register. I've already mentioned probability impact filter. We just filtered them out before we actually put something in. Tunneling or force majeure syndrome. That means that if we can't control it, a lot of people say things that we don't control are not the things that we should think about. So they just don't put things that they can't impact. Organizational can-do mentality that discourages looking for theoretical problems. Cost benefit and feasibility to plan for a wide variety of possible and untested scenarios. So as I mentioned before, if you start writing everything down, you end up with a huge list of things that will probably never materialize, but you still have to administer it. And that means that most likely your administration cost of maintaining such a list will be higher than your budget for the project. So there is a very reasonable cause not to put that way. Finally, limitations of tools and techniques. And first of all, when it comes to tools and techniques, I'd like to mention the risk register. But that's not all. First, the next thing is management reserve. We remember that with black swans, we had also unknown unknowns, and the black swan lives in the world defined by a Gauss curve or bell curve, and a bell curve has a very strong decay rate at the tails of probability distribution, which means that cumulative impact follows at least exponential decay. That's a good thing, because that means that we can actually set up a management reserve of finite amount for a wide variety of cases, because the impact is low. Gray are black swans, which are in our swan lake. They do not necessarily follow the same logic, because our historical data is flawed. It does not provide sufficiently accurate probabilities for impacts, or both for the events we are trying to protect against. More than that, in many cases, especially if the risk in social, economical, or security contexts, distributions are less likely to be Gaussian and will have significant long tails, because impacts in one area tend to reinforce impacts in another. For example, our COVID-19 pandemic spilled into economical disaster, political turmoil, security issues. So what was a problem in one area became a problem somewhere else. And with black swans, it's more likely to be like that. If the impact is extreme, it tends to reinforce and spill over into different areas. As a result, our management reserve estimates are just plain guesswork, which can be made wildly optimistic or prohibitively pessimistic, whatever approach you take. It would be like trying to guess when a COVID-19 pandemic is over. And if we gave any guesses in spring of 2020, autumn of 2020, spring of this year or now, flipping a coin would give probably as accurate prediction. Why this is important? is because building a management reserve is quoted as a primary strategy for dealing with unknown unknowns in PM Box 6. The passage has been removed in PM Box 7, and which I believe is caused by the logic I've mentioned before. As far as I'm concerned, it's gone for good. So that's it, probably. Probability impact matrix is another useless thing with Black Swans. We used this probability impact matrix already to identify the natural habitat of Black Swans, but in project management practice, some versions of this matrix perform a much more vicious function, helping to rank and prioritize risks by a function of probability and impact, hereby helping us in getting rid of all the risks that we do not feel like managing. The fact is, this tool has attracted a lot of criticism already on its own merit with any risks, not just probability, not just Black Swans. So this is why it's dubbed probability impact graph, or PIG, by being a system of usually arbitrary categories complete with arbitrary formula to produce overall risk score that we will then use in stakeholder communication as a demonstration that our judgment is not arbitrary. Now, the problem with Black Swans, however, is that as a prioritization tool, it is strongly biased to eliminate Black Swans from the picture altogether. So bottom right corner, in 20 to 30% of probability impact matrices relates to lower than average risk. This is a result of highly scientific scanning through top hits of Google to probability impact matrix. And that includes, among other, a sample of the same matrix in PM Box version 6. In other words, we tend to underestimate all swans without any clear justification to do it, because our matrix says so. The second point is that the way this tool is designed is geared to very strongly towards identified risks, which are represented by white and to a degree gray swans. This makes this matrix applicable to individual risk events rather than wide classes of risk events. And Black Swans just do not factor in the picture because precisely we cannot articulate them enough. So we cannot know what number of risks we are actually talking about. So summary so far. What we know is that Black Swans are extremely unknowns that, while being highly unlikely, have fundamental and outsized impact on societies, organizations, and projects in particular. Ability to address Black Swans either as threats or opportunities can make or break those societies, organizations, and projects. In practical terms, white or gray swans may disguise as Black Swans in the context of project or organization. Tunneling, the conscious or subconscious ignoring of extreme unknown unknowns, leaves organizations vulnerable to their consequences. And finally, existing tools and techniques of risk management in project require updating to address Black Swans. And this is why we need to unlearn the methods and approaches that these two had in our mind. So the problem with Black Swans, there is no probability attached to Black Swans. There is no articulated risk event. There is no way to determine a preventative action. What do we do? Is there another method? In fact, there is another method, and it comes from business continuity management and engineering. Let me give you an example. When an airliner company develops a new plane, this plane will probably have redundant pitot tubes that measure airspeed, no matter what can cause one of them to fail. So engineering puts redundancy, fault tolerance, and resilience into very design of the product, even before thorough analysis of possible risk scenarios. In the same way, this approach has something to do with what is known as project resiliency, or designing the architecture of the project in such a way that it would be able to minimize impacts of any risk, no matter whether known or unknown. How do we use them? First, you start with finite structure of critical success factors for your project. This is what we have on the right here. CSFs, or critical success factors, are essential assumptions that you need to be validated as true in order to achieve the project success. it should look like a success factor breakdown structure to the right side. It should be defined by your own project or architecture, as well as organizational, local, national, industrial, or global context. Going into detail only makes sense as soon as you're not losing sight of criticality. You don't want to start chasing breadcrumbs when talking about critical factors. I provided a short example, such as a product, finished product, work in progress, design, documentation, user systems, infrastructure, IT policies, governance, financial, resources, human suppliers, raw materials, financial resources, and environment, natural, economical, legal, social, safety and security, infrastructure. So these are typical things, but in your project context, it will be different. So you could look into your project, identify critical success factors, and write them down. Once you do that, next step is to allocate attributes and acceptable ranges of values for the attributes. So the example could be, for systems, you can go deeper for IT, saying that you need a data center or cloud resource to store project documents. For natural environment, you could need to expect that your construction is not in seismic zone, or that winters are not harsh. So these are factors that you need to make true to actually use. Now we can go to the third step, which is essentially contingency planning. There should be a plan for preventative or reactive response to a possibility that actual values of attributes would temporarily or permanently leave the acceptable range. The trick here, don't ask yourself, why would it, or how could it happen, or at least of all, what is the chance of it happening? Just assume it happened. Forget probability. This is the approach that accommodates risk event without even mentioning them. So you plan for response without any attempt to mitigate probability, just by trying to mitigate the impact. And that is the only surefire way to deal with black swans. For example, if I am dependent on a data center that would host project documentation, what do I do if I lose that data center? That's the question you should ask. You don't ask, why would I lose a data center? Or how possible is it to lose a data center? Well, ask yourself, what do I do if that happens? Should I have a cloud provider instead? Would I have some redundancy? What happens if logistical infrastructure breaks down, ticking along the supply chain? Do I need to source all components from the same region, or should I have a mix? It's extremely important to analyze dependencies among critical success factors, and if necessary, formulate contingency plans for eventualities when more than one CSF factor fails, especially if there is established dependency. So this is called, in our case, impact-based risk identification, which is different from what we mentioned as scenario-based risk identification. So impact-based risk register allows you to account for all types of swans, including black ones, with or without probability estimates, provided the hierarchy of critical success factors is established. In real life, you can have impact-based risk register as a separate register, complement the existing register, or integrate into it, in as long as two things are taken into account. First, as with all black and gray swans, probability is basically unknown. To a certain level, we can replace it with likelihood, which can be elementary or compound or complex, based on the Bayesian expectation that, as a rule, risk events with bigger, more complex impacts are less probable, and you can kind of attach a degree of probability as compared to other unknown unknowns. However, do not carry it away by this approach. Unless you can articulate the risk, which we can't by definition of a black swan, you cannot understand the internal dependencies. And a possible negative outcome will be underestimating probability of complex events if there are intrinsic dependencies at play. As a rule of thumb, try to consider at least a few compound risks of success factors that are clearly related, such as infrastructure and security. And absolutely, you have to consider elementary risks. Second, since we are using completely different dimensions, it's possible that risks in two of the registers will overlap, which is completely reasonable. Existing risks in your scenario-based risk register most likely impact the same hierarchy of critical success factors. This overlap can be avoided if impact-based risk register is reserved for unknown unknowns only, and you use a traditional risk register for the rest. I provided a small sample risk record transcript if you choose to integrate impact-based risk definitions into your existing risk registers, which is probably a sensible thing to do if your tools and project architecture allow that. By now, you might already have noticed that a regular risk response to unknowns is the area in which is known as project resiliency, something that was first introduced in PMBOK version 6 and has evolved into a part of the foundational project management principle of embrace adaptability and resilience. While resiliency, a more narrow concept, is defined as ability to absorb impacts and recover quickly from setback or failure, adaptability, a more holistic concept, covers general ability to respond to changing conditions, and that includes being able to adjust to any risk or exploit the opportunities rather than predict or mitigate any fixed set. In a rather simplistic view, project resiliency includes the resiliency of project architecture, resources, and environment, which, for example, could be, when we talk about architecture resiliency, redundant project documentation, systems, sites, flexible or fast decision-making, short feedback loops. One of the reasons why projects are rigid is because they set a very rigid decision-making structure, in other words, by bureaucracy, that makes decisions difficult to make, even though they are necessary. Iterative delivery, reduced dependency on fixed designs. That's something that sounds like very agile. Yes, agile is one of the methods to increase project resiliency. Look for ways how to could remove fixed upfront design and start thinking about delivering more value with smaller pieces, which create fewer exposure to unknown risks. Regular inspection and adaptation of project work. Resource resiliency, focus on engagement of resilient resources, which includes modular, interchangeable resources, reduced dependency on fixed materials, component, or tools. No single points of failure in the team, infrastructure, supply chain. Ability to use multiple suppliers if it's possible on the same task. One simple tip: if you can, try to do with more suppliers rather than one. Finally, environmental resiliency covers resiliency built into sponsoring organization, local, national, global environment, and among that we have customer agility, access of viable resources on the market, fast, flexible organizational decisions, resilient institutions, and national infrastructure. And that brings us to more or less to some conclusions. Black swan risks are important and critical elements of the overall risk profile of your projects, so should be ignored at your own peril. That covers both negative risks or threats as well as positive risks or opportunities. Yes, I've mentioned that too. We have seen now that how, by focusing on impacts rather than scenarios, by using the impact-based risk identification rather than scenario-based risk identification, you can build a risk register that allows you to account for black swans. Risk response to black swans most often revolves around building what we know as project resilience. Finally, traditional scenario-based methods are still applicable. You don't have to throw them away, but they need to be blended into impact-based methods for best coverage of risks. And this is where we have to both learn and unlearn. And hopefully you had a chance to do it today. At which point I just have to say thank you, and I'm ready to answer your questions.
Wow, Artūras, thank you very much. It was very, very interesting to listen. So yes, we do have questions. So first question, Artūrai, why do you think people prefer structured and well-established risk patterns over unstructured?
Sorry, can you repeat?
Yeah, why do you think people prefer structured and that established risk patterns over unstructured?
Sorry. I will have to ask about once again. I was.
Yeah. Why do you think people prefer well-known patterns, risk patterns, over unstructured risk patterns?
Oh yeah. Okay. So risk patterns prefer those that we know about because we want to manage. We want to be seen managing things that people know about. So just imagine you are an organization. So everybody has their mental picture of what can go wrong. And they want you, as a project manager, to take care of things that they know already. They've seen those. They have a history of that. You have a statistics. You can prove that what there is a significant probability and impact to those risks that justifies taking any kind of planning and measures. So if you can demonstrate that those risks are significant, real, and have a very sizable impact, most likely they also have a history of risk response, which is very convenient. If they are already in your lessons learned, you don't only take away the risk register, you also take away experience of response, and that's saves a lot of thinking. So you naturally are inclined to think about things that have been around for a long time and that you have historically a good record of using, rather than create new things that you didn't have any contact with.
Okay. Thank you very much. Artūras, we often see organization mentality that discourages looking for theoretical problems. Do you have any, I don't know, advice how we can change it?
I've been on the receiving side of this. I've actually had a chance to listen to people, stakeholders telling me, why are you putting a risk into your register if there is no reason it already happened? So quite a few stakeholders believe that risk management is something where you should not even start thinking about things that don't happen. So this is, in fact, they are looking for issues rather than risks to be mitigated. And that's, I believe, that comes from some organizational psychology, which that says people who are looking for problems are looking for excuses not to do things, and that's completely wrong when it comes to risk management. Project managers are doing risk management not to look for excuses, but to mitigate a chance that things will go wrong. And when we put a clear, maybe somewhat large list of things that can go wrong, a lot of people can become unhappy and try to see more to that than just our ability to plan ahead. They will look into this, say, "Oh, guys, this you are trying to frighten us with this large list of things that can go wrong." This is not about to frighten. This is about to be able to manage that.
Yeah, that's right. Could you advise to which type or size projects do you see it necessary to evaluate and spend time on UNCNO and risk scenarios analysis?
All of them.
All
all the projects can be impacted. So if if you have a small project, you will be impacted by black swans. If you have a large project, you will be impacted by black swans. The question is how important the outcome is for you and your stakeholders. So, and it is absolutely necessary to think about risks a bit differently than we did before. It's not about what you put into your risk register. It's about how you handle the things that you don't have there.
Okay.
And this is where what I'm trying to this is the message I'm trying to pass. Organizations should be built and projects should be built in such a way that are capable to react quickly to changing situation, update what they need to update, and avoid the impact of risk events that we don't predict at the moment. And that can be done only if we avoid rigid structures in our project architecture. We should be more flexible, more able to adapt, and we should create a system of fast decisions rather than slow decisions.
But Artūrai, what is the purpose of thinking about black swans in a risk identification phase if we cannot predict black swans anyhow in any project stage?
You can't. So the message I'm saying, you can't predict black swans. You're right. What you need to think is about your critical success factors. Think about what you treasure most in your project. Which resources are the most important for you? Which infrastructure, documentation, knowledge, supplier relationship is the most important for you? And now make a mental experiment of saying, let's say that disappears. It fails. It's gone. What do I do? You don't think about black swans. You talk about impact. You can have a finite number of impacts, even though you have a almost infinite number of scenarios. And that's where impact-based risk identification is more appropriate.
Okay. So Artūrai, did you have and what black swans you had in your own project experience?
Oh dear. So by now, even in synchronization, we're constantly reminded of black swans. Believe me, we've been on the receiving side of COVID-19. We've been on the receiving side of metal crisis. We've been on the receiving side of refugee crisis. So we have to take into account a lot of these things, and electricity hike is also one kind of a black swan if you are more or less looking from a long-term perspective. So this is something where we need our organizations to be ready to be surprised, and also being able to react and avoid the worst of the impact. Well, you can't avoid all of the impact, but you can avoid the worst of it.
Okay. Artūrai, thank you very much for your presentation. It was really, meaningful. And also I say thank everyone who attended today's event. In a month, we will meet at the next Pro2Pro, and of course, don't forget to follow our news on LinkedIn and Facebook. And I wish you a very nice evening ahead. Thank you very much, and see you next time.